There was a corner shop near every British home once. A pantry shelf that looked the same in Manchester as it did in Plymouth, in Glasgow as it did in Bristol. And somewhere between the 1950s and today, 20 everyday foods that millions of British families ate without a second thought simply stopped existing. No farewell tour. No final advert announcing the end. They just weren't there the next time you reached for them, and most of us didn't even notice the exact week it happened. This isn't a list built on vague memory or guesswork. Every single item here comes with a real date, a real company, and a documented reason it vanished. Because if you actually lived through this, if you stood in that corner shop with real coins in your pocket, you deserve the truth behind what happened, not a nostalgia montage with no substance underneath it. Let's start with something that wasn't just a sweet. It was a small symbol of survival in a country still recovering from war. Spangles arrived in 1948, while Britain was still living under strict wartime rationing rules that wouldn't fully end for years. Sugar was tightly controlled, and most sweets on the shelf required 2 coupons torn from your ration book. Spangles needed only one. That single detail made them one of the most quietly radical products of post-war Britain, because for a generation raised on genuine scarcity, half the cost meant nearly double the joy of a Saturday treat. Manufactured by Mars, the small square sweets, with their distinctive rounded shape and the circular depression pressed into each face, became inseparable from childhood memory for 3 full decades. Strawberry, blackcurrant, pineapple, lemon and lime, all wrapped first in simple waxed paper and later in cellophane that crackled satisfyingly when you opened it. Later came the Old English variety, dressed in black and purple packaging that felt deliberately more grown up, holding licorice, mint humbug, aniseed, and treacle flavors that tasted almost forbidden in how sophisticated they seemed compared to the regular tube. But here's what nobody tells you about how Spangles actually ended. Their death wasn't sudden, and it wasn't dramatic. Sales had already been quietly sliding through the early 1980s, as British taste began shifting towards softer, chewable sweets like opal fruits, the kind of confectionery that didn't require the patience of slow sucking. Growing public concern about tooth decay in children was also rising in health conversations of the era, adding pressure that boiled sweets in general struggled against. By 1984, Mars made the final call, and production stopped completely across the country. There was a brief, almost cruel resurrection of Spangles in 1995, sold only through Woolworths stores, and only in 4 flavors: tangerine, lime, blackcurrant, and the Old English mix. Then silence again, permanent this time, with no further attempts at revival since. In 2008, a national poll asked British shoppers which discontinued brand they most wanted brought back from the past. Spangles won that poll. Not narrowly, not by a small margin. They won by a landslide that surprised even the people running the survey. That's not idle nostalgia talking. That's an entire nation quietly grieving a sweet shop ritual it didn't fully realize it had lost, until somebody finally asked the question out loud. Now, before we go any further into this list, if you find yourself nodding along already, remembering details you'd genuinely forgotten you missed, do something for this channel right now while it's fresh in your mind. Subscribe, so you don't lose track of the next video the way Britain quietly lost half the products on this very list. Drop a comment telling me which item hit hardest for you personally, and which one you'd genuinely bring back if you had the power to do it. And if this video is stirring up a memory worth sharing, send it across to someone who'll remember it exactly the way you do. The next item on our list isn't a sweet at all. It's a ritual, a small daily act of patience that an entire generation of British schoolchildren remembers performing with their own fingers. And it involves a tiny twist of blue paper that some of you are probably picturing already just from that description alone. In 1920, a man named Frank Smith was selling plain potato crisps from a garage behind a pub in Cricklewood, North London. His young business ran into an immediate, very British kind of problem. Pub customers kept lifting the salt cellars off the bar to season their crisps themselves, and the sellers kept disappearing or running dry far too quickly. Frank's solution became one of the most enduring small ideas in British snack history. He started tucking a tiny twist of blue waxed paper inside every single bag, containing just enough salt to season it the way you personally preferred. You'd untwist it carefully, sprinkle it in, fold the top of the bag over, and shake until every crisp had a coating of your own making. It sounds like almost nothing now, described in a single sentence. At the time, it was a small daily ritual that quietly defined the taste of growing up British, a tiny act of personal control in an otherwise ordinary afternoon. By 1934, Smith's was producing 90% of every single crisp sold anywhere in the United Kingdom. By 1956, 10 million packets a week were rolling out of their various factories, an almost unimaginable number for a product that had started in a single garage behind a single pub. What people often forget when they tell the Smith story as a simple tale of changing taste is that the company didn't disappear because the idea behind it failed. It disappeared because the company itself changed hands in the way companies so often do, through ownership rather than genuine public rejection. In 1982, the American conglomerate Nabisco purchased both Smith's and its great historic rival Walker's, folding two competing British institutions under a single corporate roof for the very first time. Then in 1989, PepsiCo acquired that entire combined operation outright. The Smith's name slowly faded from supermarket shelves as Walker's became the dominant, surviving brand carrying the business forward into the 90s and beyond. The blue salt sachet itself didn't vanish completely from existence. It still technically survives today in a product called Salt and Shake, now manufactured under the Walker's name rather than Smith's. But the original Smith's bag, the grease-proof paper, the hand-folded blue twist of salt, the feeling of a corner shop that smelled faintly of vinegar and freshly fried potato, that entire small world closed quietly somewhere across the 1980s, replaced by something pre-salted, pre-packaged, and pre-decided for you before you'd even opened the bag. Here's the pattern worth noticing already this early in the story, because it repeats throughout almost everything we're about to cover. It rarely was your own taste that changed first. It was the boardroom, several hundred miles away, making a decision you were never consulted on. Moving now into the freezer aisle because this next item caused something close to genuine public outrage when it actually happened. The kind of reaction companies rarely expect from withdrawing a single dessert. Arctic Roll. A deceptively simple combination of vanilla ice cream wrapped inside a thin sponge cake casing, with a ribbon of raspberry jam running through its very center. Bird's Eye sold it from the 1970s onward, and at its commercial peak, more than 25 miles of Arctic Roll were sold across Britain every single month. Read that figure again slowly. 25 miles every month. From one single dessert product sitting in ordinary household freezers. It was the dessert of school dinners, of family teas on a Sunday, of birthday celebrations that didn't stretch to anything fancier. Then in 1997, Bird's Eye pulled it from sale entirely. The public reaction wasn't quiet, polite acceptance of a company's business decision. People genuinely complained. In letters, in newspaper columns, in the kind of grumbling that suggested something more than a snack had been taken away. It had simply gone out of fashion as British dessert tastes drifted toward more sophisticated frozen options, and the company eventually decided the sales numbers no longer justified the production line. It returned briefly in the late 2000s, but that particular version of British life is gone for good. Now here's where the story gets a little stranger, because the next item on this list wasn't really food in the traditional sense at all. It was an experience disguised as food, and an entire generation of British children built their Friday nights around exactly this product. Vesta meal kits launched in the 1960s and grew enormously popular through the 1970s. Owned by bachelors, these were dried packet meals, mostly built around Asian flavors that very few British households otherwise had any real exposure to at home. Beef curry, pata, chow mein, with crispy noodles fried separately in a pan and scattered over the finished dish at the very last moment, exactly as the packet instructed. It tasted nothing like an actual curry served in India or an actual stir-fry served in China. That was never really the point of the product. The point was the feeling of small adventure it brought into a household that otherwise ate quite traditionally, week after week, the same handful of familiar dinners. You won't find Vesta meals sitting in a British supermarket today. The brand quietly disappeared from mainstream shelves as fresh ready meals, microwave dinners, and eventually genuine takeaway delivery slowly replaced the need for a dried packet promising foreign flavor from a box. A small online market still sells a limited selection of Vesta products to people chasing that exact memory, which tells you something important about how these things actually work. The supermarket simply stopped being the place that supplied it. North of the border now, to Glasgow, where in the 1930s a company began producing something genuinely unusual for the time. Cremola foam wasn't a drink you bought ready-made off a shelf. It was a small tin of effervescent crystals, originally available in raspberry, orange and lemon, that you spooned into a glass of cold water and stirred until it fizzed up into a foaming, almost theatrical drink right there at your kitchen table. It became one of Scotland's defining childhood products, sitting proudly alongside Tunnocks tea cakes and urn brew as a genuine point of regional pride, something that felt distinctly Scottish in a way few other foods of the era managed. Nestle eventually took over production from the original Glasgow manufacturer, continuing it well into the 1990s until October of 1998, when the factory finally ceased making it for good, ending a run of roughly 4 decades. In 2016, an unopened tin from the 1970s sold at auction for £350, with the seller donating a portion of the proceeds to charity. £350 for a tin of powder that had originally cost just 10 pence. Sticking with drinks for a moment, because the next one came with a mascot that most people over 50 still remember instantly, the very second you mention 4 simple words spoken in a particular tone. It's frothy, man. Cresta launched in the early 1970s, produced by Schweppes, and it wasn't like other fizzy drinks sitting nearby on the same shelf. It poured with a thick, almost beer-like foam on top, thanks to its original formulation, and it came in flavors including strawberry, orange, pineapple, and lemon and lime, with blackcurrant added not long afterward to round out the range. The advertising campaign behind it featured an animated polar bear wearing sunglasses, drawn with exaggerated, almost manic enthusiasm, voiced with comic energy that somehow made the adverts themselves more memorable than the drink they were technically selling. It ran from the early 70s into the early 80s, and became one of the defining commercial campaigns of that entire decade, the kind people quoted at each other in playgrounds for years afterward. The drink itself didn't survive into the early 1990s. It was reportedly withdrawn from general sale due to growing concerns over its level of tartrazine, an artificial coloring that was coming under increasing public scrutiny at the time for possible links to hyperactivity in children. The bear outlived the public's trust in the very drink it had been created to sell. That's a strange kind of ending for any advertising campaign, when the mascot becomes more beloved and more enduring in memory than the product it was originally built to promote. Speaking of products that outlasted public confidence in an entirely different and much slower way, let's talk about Tab. Launched by Coca-Cola in 1963, Tab was the company's very first diet drink, arriving on shelves nearly 2 decades before Diet Coke would ever exist. Through the 1960s and 70s, it was marketed specifically toward health-conscious women, with one famous slogan calling it a beautiful drink for beautiful people, a phrase that sounds almost strange to modern ears but landed perfectly with its intended audience at the time. For an entire generation of British women trying to manage their weight in an era with very few diet drink options on the shelf, Tab wasn't just another soft drink among many. It was, for a long stretch of years, one of the only real choices available to them at all. Its decline began the precise moment Diet Coke launched in 1982, offering a flavor far closer to regular Coca-Cola than Tab had ever managed. Tab limped on in steadily shrinking markets for nearly 4 more decades after that, until Coca-Cola finally announced its full and complete discontinuation in 2020. Almost 60 years after it first appeared on British shelves, the original diet drink that gave millions of women their first taste of guilt-free fizz simply ran out of road entirely. Here's the pattern again, the one genuinely worth sitting with for a moment before we move on. None of these products failed because people stopped loving them. Spangles, Smith's, Arctic Roll, Vesta, Cremola Foam, Cresta, Tab. Every single one of them had real lasting demand right up until the precise moment a company somewhere decided that demand simply wasn't the only thing that mattered anymore. Now we move into the biscuit tin and the chocolate drawer, and into a run of sweets that disappeared not through scandal or controversy, but through something far quieter and far more common across British food history. A company simply deciding a product line wasn't worth the shelf space it occupied any longer. The Texan bar, made by Rowntree Mackintosh, vanished from shelves in 1984. It wasn't brought down by health concerns or new regulations of any kind. It was simply discontinued, as the company quietly streamlined its wider range. 20 years later, in a 2004 survey asking the British public which sweets they missed most of all, the Texan bar ranked near the very top of that entire list, a result that surprised even some of the people running the survey itself. Before we move further into the chocolate drawer, there's a smaller, quieter story worth telling properly, because it shows this pattern happening on a much more local scale than the big national brands we've covered so far. Mrs. Bumby's was a small family-run bakery business operating out of Yorkshire, delivering goods to local households via a distinctive fleet of red vans that became a familiar sight on country roads for years. It wasn't a household name across the entire country, the way Smith's or Cadbury were, but within its own region it held a genuinely loyal following. Larger manufacturers with far better distribution networks and considerably flashier packaging than a family operation could ever compete with, eventually pushed Mrs. Bumby's out of business entirely by the mid-1970s. It was simply the slow, grinding economics of scale finally catching up with a small business that had survived for years on loyalty alone. A similar story belongs to the Oneida biscuit, a revolutionary sealed package that genuinely changed snacking when it first arrived in British shops in the early 1900s. Made by Nabisco, it wasn't a particularly fancy product on its own, just a plain, slightly salty cracker, but its innovative wax paper inner wrapping kept the biscuits properly fresh in an era when most crackers and biscuits were still sold loose from open barrels in the corner shop, scooped out by hand into a paper bag. The mascot, a boy wearing a yellow raincoat known simply as the Oneida Boy, became a familiar and oddly charming sight in newspaper advertisements for decades. Despite that genuinely groundbreaking packaging innovation, changing consumer preferences for sweeter, more varied biscuits eventually led to its discontinuation sometime during the 1970s, a slow fade rather than any dramatic exit from the shelf. These two stories matter precisely because they're smaller than the others on this list. They prove this wasn't only a tale of giant companies merging and trimming their own product lines from above. Sometimes it was simply the modern world quietly outgrowing an older, smaller way of doing things, one delivery van and one local bakery at a time, until the entire model simply stopped making sense. Nestle, who had absorbed Rowntree Mackintosh by that point, brought the Texan bar back the following year as a limited edition nostalgia release in 2005. It sold extremely well, almost instantly. Then it disappeared again. Permanently this time, because limited edition meant exactly what the words said, and the company never revisited the decision after that. Pacers tell a remarkably similar story from the very same decade. They began life under the name Opal Mints before relaunching as Pacers around 1976, with 3 distinctive green peppermint stripes running through them, and an advertising campaign built around the slogan, "Peppermint striped for 2 mint freshness." Mars discontinued the brand in 1985, just 1 year after the Texan bar vanished, as though the entire mid-80s confectionery industry had collectively decided to clear house at exactly the same moment, without ever coordinating with one another directly. Then there's McVitie's Lincoln Biscuits. Simple rectangular shortbread named after the historic cathedral city, beloved for afternoon tea and for dunking in a hot cup of tea without falling apart halfway through, which was a real concern with lesser biscuits of the era. Production quietly ended sometime during the 1980s, with no public announcement of any kind, no farewell, Simply an empty space on the biscuit aisle, one week, where they used to sit the week before. If your own family had a specific biscuit tin ritual, a specific brand that always sat on the same shelf in the same cupboard year after year, type it into the comments right now while you're thinking of it. Tell me which one it was, and tell me who in your family used to hand it to you, because these small details matter more than any algorithm will ever admit, and they deserve to be written down somewhere permanent, rather than left to slowly fade inside one family's private memory until nobody remembers it at all. Because these small details matter more than any algorithm will ever admit, and they deserve to be written down somewhere permanent, rather than left to slowly fade inside one family's private memory until nobody remembers it at all. Nestle's Breakaway arrived in the 1970s, layering crispy wafer inside smooth milk chocolate that genuinely broke apart in clean, distinct segments. A design built deliberately for sharing between friends or siblings without anyone needing a knife. Production continued for decades longer than most of the other products on this list, only finally ceasing in the early 2000s, which proves that even a slow, gradual death eventually arrives, the same way the sudden ones do, just on a much longer timeline that's harder to notice while it's happening around you. And KP's Outer Spaces, flying saucer-shaped corn snacks born directly out of the 1980s space craze, sold in flavors including pickled onion and mango chutney, aimed squarely at primary school children of all places, vanished from shelves entirely as that particular decade's aesthetic obsession with space simply ran its course and moved on to something else. Rowntree's also gave Britain the Cabana bar through the 1980s, a milk chocolate bar wrapped in distinctive blue paper filled with desiccated coconut, soft caramel and pieces of glacé cherry credo a cada mordida uma pequena explosão de algo inesperado e ligeiramente exótico. Its television advert used a version of a famous calypso song, inviting a magic man to make one for you, and for a few years it genuinely rivaled Bounty for space on the same shelf. Production stopped in the early 1990s, and to this day Facebook groups and online petitions still campaign quietly for its return, decades after the last bar was actually wrapped. Macintoshes gave the country Caramac back in 1959. A bar that looked like ordinary chocolate but contained no cocoa at all, built instead from caramel and milk solids. Dándole sabor genuinamente diferente de qualquer outra coisa na prateleira de confeitaria. It survived for an extraordinarily long time, well over 6 decades, before Nestlé finally confirmed in November of 2023 that it was being discontinued due to falling sales. A decision that triggered an immediate rush among loyal customers to buy up whatever remaining stock they could find in shops before it disappeared for good. Now we move toward a different kind of disappearance entirely, away from branded 20th century products and into something that goes back much further than any item we've covered so far. Because not everything that vanished from British tables was invented by a modern food company chasing profit margins. Some of it was centuries old, passed down through entire communities rather than manufactured in a factory. Eel pie and mash was for generations the defining street food of working-class East London, every bit as common on those streets as fish and chips once were elsewhere in the country. Chopped eels, baked inside a simple pastry shell, served alongside mashed potato and a thin parsley sauce known locally simply as liquor. Eel pie shops lined East London streets for well over 100 years, passed down through families who ran them, generation after generation, in the same small premises. Their decline came from 2 directions converging at almost the same time: a genuine, well-documented collapse in the Thames eel population due to changing river conditions, and a broader shift in taste that pulled younger Londoners toward different kinds of food entirely as the city itself changed around them. Most eel pie shops had closed their doors by the 1990s. A small handful still survive today in East London, stubbornly keeping a remarkable piece of culinary history alive against genuinely difficult odds. And further back still sits frumenty, a wheat-based dish so old that almost nobody alive today has ever actually tasted it, even though it somehow survived in scattered British kitchens well into living memory before finally fading out almost completely from everyday cooking. It serves as a quiet reminder that this list isn't only about branded 20th century nostalgia, it's about an entire pattern of British food slowly disappearing across centuries. There's a slightly different kind of disappearance worth mentioning here too. One that didn't involve a product vanishing completely, but something almost stranger, a product staying on the shelf while quietly shrinking underneath its own packaging. Wagon wheels first launched at the Olympia Food Fair in London in 1948. Then, after production moved from the original slough factory to a new site in Llantham, South Wales, during the early 1980s, something measurable happened. The width of the British wagon wheel was reduced from 79mm down to 74mm, and it lost its distinctive crimped edge in the process. For years, the manufacturer publicly insisted nothing had actually changed, suggesting instead that adult hands had simply grown larger since childhood, making the same biscuit feel smaller by comparison alone. It became known almost affectionately as the wagon wheel effect. The documented measurements eventually told a different story than the official explanation did, proving the biscuit truly had been made smaller, not just remembered differently by grown-up hands. It's a small, almost funny detail, but it captures something genuinely important about how this entire pattern actually works in practice. Sometimes a product simply gets quietly reduced, piece by piece, decision by decision. Macintosh's Animal Bar followed a more familiar pattern. Launched back in the 1960s and sold for decades afterward as small bars of genuine chocolate containing no artificial colors, flavors or preservatives, deliberately designed for small children, each one printed with a simple picture of two animals alongside a short game. It survived for well over half a century, before finally being scrapped in 2023, announced in the very same year as Karamac's own discontinuation, the same company quietly closing two long-running chapters of British childhood within a matter of months of each other, citing the same familiar explanation of declining sales that we've now heard repeated throughout almost this entire list. We're nearing the final stretch of this list now, and what comes next brings us back to something closer to home, the everyday kitchen staples that didn't need a corporate scandal or a dramatic buyout to disappear from your table. They simply stopped being made because the world around them moved on faster than they ever could. Golden Wonder, founded in Edinburgh in 1947, was the genuine rival to Smith's through the 1960s and 70s. The company responsible for pushing flavor variety into British crisps in the very first place, including that famous cheese and onion packet in a green bag, which confused generations of shoppers who automatically assumed green must mean Smith's, when it actually meant the opposite. Golden Wonder still technically exists today as a company name, but the brand that once dominated British crisp shelves alongside Smith's has had, by any honest description, a deeply complicated and significantly diminished few decades since those glory years. Happy Face biscuits brought a small, specific joy to childhood that's easy to underestimate when you only describe it in passing. Round vanilla biscuits topped with piped yellow icing and chocolate chip eyes and a smile, designed purely to make a child grin during an otherwise ordinary, uneventful afternoon. They disappeared sometime in the early 2000s, taking with them a small, strange piece of childhood optimism that no replacement biscuit on the shelf has ever quite managed to recapture in the years since. Cadbury gave Britain two further products worth remembering carefully here. The Spira, a spiral-shaped chocolate bar trialled regionally in northeast England in the mid-1980s, before its popularity earned it a full national rollout across the rest of the country. Two hollow, twisted chocolate fingers per pack, instantly recognizable on sight even decades later. And the Fuse, which combined milk chocolate with nuts, peanuts, raisins, crisp cereal and fudge pieces all inside a single bar, becoming particularly beloved inside Cadbury Heroes selection boxes before quietly disappearing from the standalone shelf altogether, surviving for a while only as a smaller piece inside someone else's selection tin. There was also the Trio, a toffee-flavored biscuit bar wrapped in distinctive red paper, first produced by Jacobs and a genuinely popular snack throughout the 1980s. Jacobs eventually stopped producing it in 2003. It is iconic for its loud, animated mascot Susie, who shouted the jingle Trio, "I want a Trio and I want one now." It made a brief limited comeback in 2016 under the McVitie's name, sold for a short period before disappearing once again. The exact same pattern of revival and second disappearance that's run through almost every single product on this entire list, as though companies keep discovering the same lesson and then forgetting it all over again a few years later. And then there's Angel Delight, introduced by Birds in 1967, with strawberries and cream as its very first flavor on shelves. You added cold milk to a sachet of powder, whisked it for a few short minutes by hand, and watched it gradually set into a mousse-like dessert that British children adored almost universally across an entire generation, regardless of region or background. By the 1980s and 90s, that original everyday version of Angel Delight had largely vanished from regular home kitchens. Pushed aside as fresher, shop-bought desserts became cheaper and more convenient than they'd ever been before in the chilled aisle. It still technically exists on some shelves today, in a reformulated version, but the version that sat in nearly every household cupboard, the one that genuinely defined an entire era of British tea time, that particular cultural moment has firmly passed into history. There's one more item from the freezer that deserves its own proper telling, because its story is more complicated than people usually remember. Finder's crispy pancakes first appeared on British shelves around 1958, though it was the relaunched 1970 version that truly became the staple most people picture today. Thin pancakes filled with minced meat, cheese, or ham, wrapped in a crisp breadcrumb shell that crackled the moment your fork touched it. Finder's discontinued the original product line in 2002. A quiet end that genuinely surprised longtime fans who'd assumed it would simply always be there in the freezer aisle, the way certain products feel permanent, right up until the exact moment they aren't anymore. Birdseye eventually brought crispy pancakes back to supermarkets, years later, under their own name rather than the original Finder's branding, with a slightly updated recipe containing notably more filling than the original ever did. So in a strange, partial way, this is one of the few entries on our list with something resembling a happy ending. Even if the version available today and the version remembered from a 1970s kitchen table aren't quite the same product wearing the same name. So here is what 20 separate products, spanning very nearly 7 full decades of British life, actually add up to when you lay them all out together in one place. Spangles, Smith's Salt and Shake, Arctic Roll, Vesta Meal Kits, Cremola Foam, Cresta, Tab, the Texan Bar, Pacers, McVitie's Lincoln Biscuits, Nestle's Breakaway, Outer Spaces, the Cabana Bar, Caramac, Eel Pie Shops, Frumenty, Golden Wonders Golden Era, Happy Face Biscuits, Cadbury's Spira and Fuse, alongside the Trio Biscuit Bar, and Angel Delight and Finder's Crispy Pancakes, both as they once genuinely were, sitting in a kitchen that no longer quite exists in the same form. None of these disappeared because Britain simply stopped caring about them one day. They disappeared because caring was never actually the metric anyone sitting in a boardroom was measuring when the final decision got made. Sales charts, distribution costs, shelf space negotiations, mergers nobody ever asked your permission to approve. That's what ended these products, one after another, across 7 decades. Not you, not your generation's tastes somehow failing or moving on. A balance sheet decided in a room you were never once invited into, by people who never stood in your actual kitchen on a Friday night with a Vesta curry steaming gently on the stove behind them. And maybe that's the real reason this particular list still matters, decades later, to anyone who genuinely lived through it rather than simply reading about it afterward. Because these weren't only products sitting on a shelf. They were quiet markers of time itself. The blue twist of salt was a small lesson in childhood patience. The Arctic roll was a sundae that felt slightly more special than an ordinary one. The Vesta curry was the closest thing to genuine adventure some households ever experienced on an average weeknight. Spangles were the taste of one single ration coupon somehow stretching a little further than it had any right to. When you lose a product like this, you don't only lose the flavor itself. You lose a small specific door back into a version of your own life that nobody else can ever open for you again. Not quite the same way. That's worth holding on to properly, even now, all these years later. Not by simply buying some limited nostalgia re-release that vanishes again within a year or two anyway, but by remembering it properly, talking about it out loud, telling someone younger exactly what it actually felt like at the time, because they will otherwise never truly know. If you let that particular memory go quiet without ever speaking it aloud, it doesn't just gently fade away on its own. It disappears the exact same way these 20 products did, silently, without anyone ever marking the precise moment it actually happened, until one day it's simply gone and nobody can quite pinpoint when. So don't let it happen quietly this time. Not after everything we've just gone through together. Tell me in the comments which one of these 20 hit you hardest personally, and tell me what you remember about it specifically. Who first gave it to you, where you were standing or sitting at the time, what it actually tasted like during the very last time you had it, before it disappeared for good without you ever realizing that was the last one. And if this video gave you back something you'd genuinely forgotten you'd lost somewhere along the way, do one simple thing before you go. Share it with someone else who will remember it exactly the way you do. Someone from the same kitchen, the same street, the same era. And if you want more of these properly researched journeys back through real British life before even more of it quietly changes for good, subscribe to this channel right now, because there is a great deal more of this history still waiting to be told accurately, while there's still time left to tell it properly. This was British Nostalgia. We keep the tables